Welcome to the University of New South Wales, Canberra, Australian Naval History video and podcast series, produced in partnership with the Naval Institute, the Naval Historical Society, Navy's Sea Power Centre and the Submarine Institute. Thank you for joining us. For more information on this series, please visit the UNSW Canberra Naval Studies Group website. To find us, simply Google Navy Studies Group and UNSW Canberra. Ours will be the first website in the search results. We hope you enjoy the podcast and return for others in the series. I'm Greg Swinden, Senior Naval Historical Officer at the Sea Power Centre Australia. This video and podcast episodes discuss one of the most significant ships in the history of the Royal Australian Navy during World War II. This is the light cruiser HMAS Sydney, the second ship to carry this illustrious name. Commissioned in the RAN in 1935, her exploits in the Mediterranean in 1940 were to make her a household name following the action at the Battle of Cape Spada, where she played a leading role in the destruction of the Italian cruiser Bartolomeo Colleoni. This is the first of two episodes that will track the Sydney's World War II service. The second episode will discuss her tragic loss in November 1941. To tell us about the fascinating story of HMAS Sydney and her valuable World War II service, I have joining me Vice Admiral Peter Jones of the Naval Studies Group, whose book Australian Argonauts discusses John Collins, a member of the first class to enter the RAN College and who commanded Sydney in the Mediterranean. Also joining us is Mr. Wes Olsen, who is the author of two books about the famous cruiser, HMAS Sydney in Peace and War, and Bitter Victory, The Death of HMAS Sydney. Also, John Perryman, the Navy's historian and Director of Strategic and Historical Studies at the Sea Power Centre Australia. John, leading off, what can you tell us about ship Sydney and the men who served in her?
Well, as you said in your introduction, it's a very big story, and starting with the ship is a great place to start. HMAS Sydney was a modified Leander-class cruiser. She was one of three purchased by the Royal Australian Navy in build from the Royal Navy. Originally, she was laid down as HMS Phaeton, and whilst in build, she was renamed Sydney. She was a fast, modern warship. She mounted 8 6-inch guns, 4 4-inch guns, 8 21-inch torpedo tubes, carried in 2 quadruple mountings. So she was a very modern, well-equipped ship, and really just what the Royal Australian Navy needed in the lead up to what would be the second great conflict of the 20th century. The men who served in her, most of whom were regulars at the beginning of the war, they'd gone over and picked Sydney up in build. Many of them had travelled over in HMAS Brisbane, which had been given to the Brits in part payment for it, and they brought her back to Australia, where she enjoyed some years of peacetime sailoring before the war commenced.
Yeah. Peter, her commanding officer, John Collins, member of the first class of 1913 at the Naval College, he was in command of Sydney at the beginning of the war. What was he like?
Okay, so John was one of the leading lights of that class, and John Collins was the commissioning executive officer or second in command of the cruiser, and so he was involved in the setting up the ship's company, the working up of the ship, and then its delivery voyage to Australia, and really sort of helping set that culture that was in the ship. At the beginning of the war, though, he was actually the acting chief of naval, the assistant chief of naval staff. So he was a captain in Navy office, quite well placed to actually understand how the war was actually progressing, and played a pretty important part in the naval headquarters. He was then, after doing a very good job there, then posted in command of the Sydney. So when he came back, he really was going back to a ship he knew very well. Many of the crew on board were still the ones that had commissioned the ship all those years previously. When he joined, he talked to them about the importance of playing hard, working hard, don't drift, and to keep a smile on your face. And so he really was one of those captains who thought you needed a hard-working, happy ship for one to be very effective. And he also was a gunnery specialist, and in fact he won the Edgerton Prize for the best officer both in the Australian Navy and the Royal Navy in UK pass out that year in gunnery training. So he was very good at gunnery, and that was also an important aspect as the ship went to the Mediterranean.
So he was the right man for the job.
Absolutely.
Right. Wes, what was Sydney doing on the Australia station before she departed for the Mediterranean?
Well, Sydney's primary role while on the Australia station was trade protection. So for the first 10 weeks of the war, she was based at Fremantle in Western Australia, tasked with patrolling the shipping lanes, escorting selected ships and raider hunting. Mid-December, she came back to her home port in Sydney for her annual refit, and then returned to the West in February 1940. Picked up again where she'd left off, but Collins had been informed while the ship was in the East Coast that to expect an overseas deployment early, mid-1940. His next big mission, I suppose, was to help escort the second Australian troop convoy, US-2, was taking Australian troops to the Middle East. Sydney was part of the escort for that, and she was tasked to go as far as Cocos Keeling Islands, then hand over to a French cruiser, then come back to Fremantle. And Collins was under the understanding that Sydney would take the next convoy, US-3, through to the Middle East. But 2 days out from Fremantle, his orders suddenly changed. He was told to turn around, proceed to Colombo at best possible speed. And it was part of this deployment happening much sooner than expected. At this stage, Italy looked like she was going to enter the war against Britain and France, and the Admiralty was trying to get as many ships into the threatened zone as possible, either into the Mediterranean fleet or into the Red Sea. Sydney got to Colombo. She then had orders to go into the Red Sea. Looked like she was going to be joining Hobart there. But on arrival at Aden, his orders changed again. Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Eastern Mediterranean Fleet, decided he wanted an Australian cruiser, and he wanted Sydney.
Right. So John, Sydney arrives in the Mediterranean. What's happening there at that stage?
Sydney's arrival in the Mediterranean came at a time where the situation could not have been more precariously balanced. You've got to understand that in late May, the British Expeditionary Force had been forced off the beaches of Dunkirk. On the 10th of June, France surrendered, and there was a great concern then about what would happen to the French warships. While Britain had France still in the game in the Mediterranean, it had the forces, along with its allied ships, to maintain that balance of power in the Mediterranean. When France fell, and the question mark was placed over what would happen to the French ships, would they be interned? Would the Germans get them? Would they remain in British ports? Where would they go? Would they take any further part in the war? The whole situation changed. The Italians had a vastly superior fleet in the Mediterranean, and it must be remembered that the Mediterranean is quite a confined sea. I think on average it's about 500 nautical miles wide, and it's, if you average that out. And then you take into consideration Italy and how it comes down into the Mediterranean. It had its seaports there, which it could very, very easily sustain. Its ships could do sorties from Italy and go back to them for repairs, to re-ammunition. The British were far from home. So the great game that was to be played, the strategic game, was how Britain, with the help of the Commonwealth navies, was going to deal with the threat of the Italians coming into the war and the capitulation of the French. Now that actually happens on the 22nd of June. So Sydney arrives, and not long after that, 22nd of June, Italy comes into the war following the French surrender, and you now have this shift that everybody feared. So Sydney's contribution and arrival on the scene could not have come at a more timely period for Admiral Cunningham, and she was assigned to the 7th Cruiser Squadron on arrival. Cunningham's strategic view of the situation, he understood that basically the line dividing the Mediterranean was Italy itself, which actually virtually cut in half the British naval forces, one in the Western Mediterranean, one in the East. So there were problems there to begin with. And they had a very, very modern, versatile navy, albeit an untested navy. So, you know, it was a situation of unknowns, and the great game was about to play out.
Yeah. Yes, I see. It was quite a desperate situation at the time, and obviously Italy owned Libya as well, so they had a foothold on the North African coast as well.
Well, this is it, and the great challenge also was to deny Italy and the Axis forces the ability to use the Mediterranean to both resupply their forces in North Africa and get the resources from North Africa back to Italy and Germany to fight their war. And those resources were precious: oil, tin, rubber, those sorts of things. So strategically, the Mediterranean was very, very important. Whoever commanded the Mediterranean would hold the upper hand.
So Peter, Admiral Cunningham, ABC, as he's known to many of his men, was in command of the British fleet in the Mediterranean. What was he like? Who was he? Was he the right man for the job?
He certainly was. He was very offensive-minded.
Mm-hmm.
He had a very unusual career. He spent, for example, 7 years in command of the destroyer Scorpion in the lead up to and during most of World War I. And he took part in the Gallipoli campaign, and in fact he provided support during part of the Anzac landings. So he had and was involved when the Anzacs were being evacuated. So he had quite a good disposition towards Australians. And to follow Wes's point, I think that's one of the reasons why he was keen to get the Australian cruiser into the Mediterranean. His approach was to imbue his commanding officers with that offensive spirit. He believed that looking at the strategic situation as John has described, his best course of action was to go on the offensive, try and get that psychological superiority against the Italians, and to imbue into his commanding officers to seek battle whenever they could. He also was very much of the mind to encourage commanding officers to use their initiative. His orders sometimes could be very succinct. John Collins talks about going on a patrol and going to the flagship, the Warspite, and just getting a verbal order of what he wanted to do, and that was it. So that gave commanding officers, if they had the right mind, a lot of scope to use their initiative and judgment at sea. And that was to work very well for John Collins and the Sydney.
So what was the relationship between Cunningham and Collins?
So the other player, of course, was, Sydney was in the 7th Cruiser Squadron. So as Rear Admiral Tovey was in command of that squadron. So that was John's immediate boss, if you like. He also was very offensive-minded, but quite often the Commander-in-Chief would talk direct to captains, particularly if they're going on patrols by themselves or taking the lead for a particular sweep. So he had a number of sweeps with ships going out looking for trouble, as John Collins talked about, and just to try and get that sort of superiority and to gain control of that part of the Mediterranean. So it was a relationship which just grew as Cunningham could see individual captains had the competence, drove their ships well, and had that fighting spirit. And as time got on, you could see that Collins was getting that confidence. The other relationship, which is not often mentioned, is Collins was a senior Australian. So there was the destroyer squadron there as well, but he was a senior Australian on the spot. And so there were some things that he was able to achieve. For example, he was able to get an extra meat ration for Australian sailors. So they got double the amount of meat compared to a Royal Navy sailor. So it was things like that he had a direct link in with Admiral Cunningham, and that sort of helped in that relationship.
Wes, it's not long after Sydney's arrived, Italy's entered the war, and she goes on her first offensive action against Bardia in Libya. What happened there?
Bardia was a problem for Cunningham. When the Italians entered the war against Britain and France on the 11th of June, his fleet base at Alexandria became exposed to attack by the enemy's air, naval and land forces. We mentioned that the Italians held Libya, that's just across the border basically. So the Italians had something like 250,000 troops in Libya. The Brits had 36,000 in Egypt. Alexandria was 250 miles away from the border. So they were the real threat to his fleet base. If the Italians decided to invade, there was very little to stop them. Bardia was a fortified port and town very close to the frontier. It was the Italians' chief supply base for all their forces on the frontier. So by striking at Bardia, Cunningham would effectively be disrupting any Italian invasion plan and disrupting their supply channels. Mm-hmm. So he decided to attack it at dawn on the 21st of June. Basically, he chose Orion, Toby's flagship, Neptune and Sydney, and the French battleship Lorraine to do the bombardment. They each had their own aircraft aloft for spotting. Sydney's got into trouble fairly early on. What they thought were Italian fighters turned out to be RAF Gladiators, mistook Sydney's biplane for a Italian aircraft and basically shot it up. It managed to, or the pilot, Flight Lieutenant Tommy Price, managed to nurse that aircraft across the border back into friendly territory, and everyone got out alive. He subsequently got a Distinguished Flying Cross for his effort. But Sydney was left to carry on with the bombardment by herself. But this is something that the crew, ship's company, had been training for 9 months, 10 months. It was the first time they'd be firing in action against a real enemy. And their excitement about going into action was sort of tempered by the knowledge that the Italians were defending Bardia with batteries of 6-inch and 8-inch naval guns. It turned out to be a bit of an anticlimax because the enemy batteries were silenced or failed to come into action. Mm-hmm. So Sydney's crew were able to just pin their ears back and plaster their target. It was basically a military barracks block. Orion was tasked with taking out the all-important water pumping station. And the end of the exercise, they did what they were tasked to do and got away virtually scot-free. But it was the first real test of Sydney's gunners. Everything worked perfectly. Sydney got away more rounds than Orion and Neptune, and they thought it was a good opening stand basically against the Italians. So
it sounds like Collins, being the gunnery officer, had made sure that they were well trained for their action. Yeah. So John, just 5 days later, after the attack on Bardia, the 7th Cruiser Squadron encounters an Italian convoy. What happened in that action?
This was the action that led to the engagement with the destroyer Espero, and during that action they rumbled an Italian destroyer force, which was subsequently engaged. And this, to me, this is where the crew of Sydney really have their first encounter with the face of naval battle, up close. Much more up close than probably they anticipated. And I'd like to focus on the Espero in this because she's soon crippled by Sydney, and Sydney's ordered to basically go back and finish her off. And the ship is there in a state of almost extremis, but still defiantly firing away at Sydney when she's gone back to try and, in anticipation of taking on the survivors, to be frank. Mm-hmm. And this gallant little Italian destroyer is still full of fight. And there'd been a lot of questions raised about, how willing or otherwise the Italians would be to actually get in the fight. And this gallant little ship, the Espero, demonstrates that they were. It continues to fire at Sydney, and Collins is then compelled to put a full broadside into it, which ends proceedings. They then go on to rescue survivors, but I'll let Peter talk about that personal interaction, particularly in how it affected Collins.
Yes, so, and this comes out in both Collins's recollections and also Commander Hilton, who was the commander, in his papers. He talks about, as John said, both of them on the bridge talking about how they're going to recover survivors, and then the Espero then fires a torpedo and continues to fire until they silenced her. But the takeaway for John Collins was that was a near-run thing. They nearly got torpedoed, and that they had to be very watchful about how they conduct business. Clearly, when they're operating against the Italian Navy, they will see people who operate in a very brave way, and they've got a foe they must respect, but also the fact that they've got to husband the advantages that they have. So the advantages in that case were had the firepower, so don't get too close. And the thing that comes a lot in Sydney's service in the Mediterranean is they learn by each experience, and as they go along, they just get better and better. But from the command perspective, he learnt there to just be marshal what advantages you have, but be very watchful and just manage your risks carefully.
But I also believe that Collins stayed behind and possibly risked his ship to more damage by actually rescuing survivors from Espero, and even when it came to the time he had to leave, he left a boat behind. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. And going back to Hilton, before they left Australia, he had spoken to a New Zealand cruiser who was involved in the Battle of River Plate, and the commander there had come up with this idea of fully provisioning with water and food and so on all the lifeboats. So if you were sunk, every lifeboat had all those provisions for a long sea voyage back to a port. So Hilton did that, and so when Collins decided that it was too hot, the risk he was posing for his ship for a submarine attack, or maybe from the Italian Air Force, was getting too great as it was nearing dusk, he then left a cutter, and in fact 7 of the Italian sailors who were left in the water were able to get on board, and in fact one of those sailors ended up emigrating to Australia after the war and set up electrical business. So, but reading the diary of some of the sailors, they thought that was a great thing, and it showed a good sense of humanity on the part of Collins to do that.
Yes, we've destroyed you, but we've got a level of compassion as well. Yeah. Whereas the next action for Sydney is the Battle of Calabria, and this is the first time for a century that opposing fleets had met in the Mediterranean. So can you explain what happened there?
Yeah, this was a big one, Battle of Calabria. It was the first real test of the ship's company. Be the first time they were going to be exposed to anything like a full-on naval battle, and also air attack, sustained air attack. When Sydney sailed from Alexandria on the night of the 7th of July with the battle fleet, no one had any idea. This was for a convoy covering operation. They were heading off into central Mediterranean, then on to Malta to pick up 2 convoys. No one knew that the Italians were already out there. They were engaged in a similar operation. They'd sent out a major force of battleships, cruisers and destroyers to protect a troop and supply convoy going into Libya. So they set sail not knowing what was going to happen. On the 8th of July in the afternoon, British and Italian reconnaissance aircraft were up, and they started spotting these different ships out there, and the different commanders suddenly realised there's something going on. The reconnaissance reports were basically indicating large Italian warships were at sea, and Brits were doing the same. Cunningham realised he had a chance to cut off this Italian fleet, He assumed it was running a convoy, protecting a convoy going to Libya, and it would have to go home, and it had to go home to Taranto. And that was basically, he was in a position to cut it off. The Italians were also keen for battle. Admiral Campione, he was aware the British fleet was at sea. He deduced that it was heading towards Malta, so he was keen for a battle as well. It came on the afternoon of the 9th. It initially started with a cruiser action. Sydney was with the 7th Cruiser Squadron. It had been reduced by 1 because Gloucester had been bombed by an enemy aircraft the previous day, so she was out of it. So Tovey only had 4 cruisers under his command, his own ship Orion, Sydney, Neptune and Liverpool. They saw the Italians. Neptune was the first to realise that the fleet was there, and she made that signal, enemy battle fleet in sight.
That's the first time since the Napoleonic Wars,
First
I
time
believe.
since Nelson's time, yeah. And 2 Italian cruisers opened fire shortly afterwards. They were soon joined by another 2, then they were soon joined by another 4. So within minutes, basically, Sydney and her 3 companions are under a massive assault. You've got 8 cruisers against 4, and things weren't going particularly well. Sydney was doing what she was being trained to do. She's firing back, but each ship was taking on 2, and it was pretty unequal. The problem was their battle fleet, the British battle fleet, was 20 miles astern. But Cunningham realised what was in the offing, and his flagship Warspite was a little bit faster than the rest of his fleet. He had another 2 battleships bringing up the rear. So he decided to steam ahead, and he arrived in the nick of time. Warspite announced her presence to these Italian cruisers by a salvo of 15-inch shells. 9 more salvos and the Italians had enough. They saw these massive columns of water rising up around their ships, and they thought, bugger this, and so they withdrew under cover of smoke. There was basically then a pause, a 20-minute pause, while Campione got his battleships, his 2 battleships into position, and got his heavy cruisers into position, and then it started again. So you've got Warspite now slugging it out with 2 Italian battleships, Giulio Cesar and Cavour, and things weren't looking too good. Sydney and her 3 companions, they were now copping fire from heavy cruisers, 8-inch shells, and at times Sydney was just disappearing in the spray from shell splashes. And at one stage, one of the British ships thought Sydney was gone. She just disappeared into this wall of water, and they thought, that's it, she's gone. And she steamed out with the guns blazing, and everyone thought it was a miracle. The real miracle was about to happen. Warspite, at a range of 13 miles, got a hit on Giulio Cesar, and that did massive damage. These are huge shells. And that battleship pulled out of the line. Campione was prepared to continue with Conte de Cavour, his flagship. He was quite prepared for his heavy cruisers to continue hammering Tovey's 4 light cruisers. But then Malaya had slowly made up ground, and she came into the equation.
That's another British battleship.
That's another British battleship. Yep. She was initially 20 miles astern, but she'd managed to catch up. And once she started firing, Campione realised, well, this is not good. It's 2 battleships against me. And in the meantime, the carrier Eagle had flown off a strike of Swordfish, and they came in and started attacking the Italian heavy cruisers. So at this point, the Italians, it was pretty much even, but they'd taken a bit of a pasting. Our cruisers had got away fairly lightly. They'd been plastered with shells, but no real damages had been sustained. But the Italians thought, no, this is it, we've had enough. So they withdrew under cover of smoke. They sent in their destroyers to lay a smoke screen, and they scarpered. And basically, Sydney came out of that very well. She'd fired off something like 411 rounds of ammunition, came out virtually without a scratch. Everyone thought, well, this is it, we've survived our first dinky bloody sea battle. And they were all looking forward to heading home. Unfortunately, they still had to get to Malta. Then they still had to take the convoys back. And the Italians had been stirred into action by now, and the Italian Air Force was keen to exact a bit of revenge and take a toll of the British fleet. And Sydney copped a bit of a pasting. She was at times singled out all the way back virtually to Egyptian waters until RAF aircraft came to drive off the bombers. But Sydney was a little bit handicapped. She only had single 4-inch guns. The other British warships had double the number of anti-aircraft guns. So she put up a brave fight and managed to beat off a number of attacks, but she fired off every single round of HE at the attacking aircraft. In the end, she was reduced to firing 4-inch practice shells to try and keep the bombers away. So as a first outing in a real battle, Sydney came through with flying colours. She'd taken the brunt of the Italian light cruisers, the heavy cruisers, the Italian Air Force, and she came home without a scratch. She had no casualties. I think she had a signal shot away, and that was about it. And that was where she earned her nickname, Lucky Sydney.
Very lucky.
Very.
John, there's no rest for the wicked, and Sydney's back at sea in the middle of July, and that's where on the 19th her most famous action occurs. Can you explain what that was?
Certainly July 1940 was a period of great excitement for HMAS Sydney, and on the 19th of July, yes, the Battle of Cape Spada. So that operation was it was to support a destroyer sweep under the commander of Commander Nicholson. He had 4 destroyers: Hyperion, Hero, Hasty and Ilex, and Sydney was sent with her and another destroyer, the Havoc, to cover that force. And essentially the destroyer force was to conduct a patrol from east to west along the northern coast of Crete, culminating at Cape Spada, which is if you look at a chart of the island of Crete, you'll see it's almost like a spur that at the very
juts out.
Juts out, yeah. Anyway, the two forces were separate, so Nicholson and his 4 destroyers are doing their thing, patrolling, and Sydney is elsewhere with Havoc. Now, what John Collins does is he looks at the strategic and the tactical situation and aligns himself that if on the western side of this beat by the destroyers they were to run into trouble, he would need to pre-position himself where he would be best placed to provide cover. So the two forces are quite separate. They're in communications, but not visual communications. Right? It's Morse code by wireless. So on the morning of the 19th of July, Nicholson's force encounters 2 Condottieri class Italian cruisers off the sort of west-northwest coast of Crete at around about 7:30 in the morning. They send out an enemy contact report. They're spotted at the same time by the Italians. They turn heel and start to run for it, with the Italians giving chase. So a little bit like Wes explained in the previous battle, you've now got these 4 destroyers pretty well running for their lives against 2 of the fastest ships, not just in the Italian Navy, but in the world. In speed trials, the Bartolomeo Colleoni had in fact clocked something like 42 knots.
That's pretty
which
fast.
is a pretty good clip when you consider it. So they were 2 knots faster than these destroyers easily, and they were overhauling them. So when Sydney received word that Nicholson was in contact with the enemy, he and Havoc shaped their course to intercept. And this is where I think Collins again comes to the fore in recognising the importance of preparing his men for a battle that's about to commence. He works out that he's some 40 nautical miles distant, okay? And when he turns his ships, he has time to send the men for breakfast. I understand that not too many of them took that invitation, but nevertheless, breakfast, hands to breakfast was piped before they went to action stations. And at the time that they rendezvoused with Nicholson's destroyer force, they could see the Giovanni della Bandonera and the Bartolomeo Colleoni quite on the horizon, giving these destroyers a pretty hot time. They had maintained radio silence, so they didn't tell Nicholson that they were closer than everyone had anticipated at that point. They thought that Sydney and Havoc were much further away than what they were. So you can imagine the concern that was in the minds of the destroyer men at that time. This was a pretty,
They were in a desperate situation.
They were in a very desperate situation. And then over the horizon, who should come but Sydney and Havoc? And Sydney's arrival was announced with salvos being fired at these Italian cruisers, and they were caught pretty well unaware. And that's when the Battle of Cape Spada really turns hot and turns into this great chase.
Okay. Wes, can you, following on from what John's spoken about here, can you then explain how that action unfolds?
Yeah, basically, well, initially, Collins had no idea what he was up against. He knew there was 2 cruisers. He didn't know if they were light cruisers or heavy cruisers. He didn't know if they were screening a larger force to the west of Crete. So by just charging in like he did, he was taking a pretty big risk. But he was prepared to take that risk. He'd spoken to his commander, Hilton, about it, and they agreed that if they charged headlong, there's a good chance the Italians would panic and run. And initially they didn't. The 2 Italian ships were sighted off the starboard bow. They were moving from right to left. The gunnery officer Singer was instructed to aim for the first ship, Bandonniere, and he got his first salvo away without the Italians realising what was going on, which was a great thing. Element of surprise was vital. And it came as a great shock to the Italians because there was a bit of a sea mist, fog to the north. They didn't know Sydney was there. All they could see was these gun flashes. And it took them nearly 3 minutes to get their act together and find out what was going on and return fire. And Singer, meanwhile, was just flinging salvos, rapid salvos. Initially, he was just using his 2 forward turrets. And once he got his line of length, so to speak, he opened broadsides fire. And again, this was another surprise for the Italians because suddenly you've got another group of salvos coming in, a larger salvo coming in. So he thinks he's up against 2 cruisers instead of 1. And he was prepared to continue the chase of the destroyers until he got hit. Sydney landed a 6-inch shell on Bandonniere, and that sort of changed his attitude abruptly. He took casualties. The damage wasn't severe, but he thought, no, it's not for me. So he turned away. And at this point, Collins realised, we've got them. They're doing exactly what we hoped they'd do. They're turning. They turn behind smoke. And at this point, Nicholson, even without instructions, knew what he had to do. He swung his destroyers around and he's charging full pelt back towards his assailants. Casardi, who's in command of these 2 cruisers, his flagship is Bandonniere, he realises, no, this is not for me. So he alters course again and starts running. The fighting withdrawal. His 2 ships are flinging shells back. Initially, they could only see the flashes, so as soon as the mist cleared and they could see that one of the larger ships was doing all the firing, which was Sydney, they were able to concentrate their fire on Sydney. So it's almost like Calabria all over again. Sydney is being outgunned. But by this stage, she's working like a well-oiled machine. The gunnery department have been perfecting their art all through the fighting against the Italians. They're getting better and better and better at their job. They're getting more accurate. They're having less breakdowns in the machinery. Everyone knows what to do. So you have a classic chase. You've got 2 Italian cruisers running away from Sydney, and Sydney is just firing for all she's worth. The only problem is the Italians were laying smoke, so every now and again the target would be obscured. So Sydney would have to switch targets. The Italians had the luxury of just concentrating their fire on Sydney. The inevitable happened. Sydney took a hit. A shell exploded on her forward funnel, blew a massive hole in it, about 3 foot square. And everyone realised that if that shell had been fired just a fraction of a second sooner, that would have been the bridge gone. Your command structure would have been wiped out. Collins probably would have been killed. But fortune favoured the bold. They pushed on. And short time later, the gunnery control noticed that their target at this point, Colleone, was slowing down. Unknown to them, they'd already scored a hit themselves. In fact, 2 hits. She took a vital one in a boiler room. It knocked out 2 boilers. Shrapnel damaged the condenser on the main engines in the forward engine room. So basically she's losing power and she's very soon dead in the water. Sydney continues to fire at Colleone as the gap closes. Then she realises, Colleone's finished, I'll let the destroyers take care of her. Collins continues with the chase, chasing Bandoniere, and he eventually scores, Collins Singer eventually score another hit on Bandoniere, but that just doesn't do anything to slow her down. Casati is keen to get out of there and he's put the pedal down and he's gone. He's not coming back. Colleone was to be abandoned to a fate.
John, have you got anything else to add to that action?
I think that one of the interesting things about what Wes was saying is that the rate of fire that Sydney achieved during that action, when they had all 4 turrets bearing, they were getting away something like 64 rounds a minute, which was a pretty decent rate of effort. And the other thing which I think is interesting when you read some of the diaries of the men, here they are in the thick of action. Like Wes very correctly pointed out, they didn't know whether these were 8-inch gun cruisers or 6-inch gun cruisers. So this was a pretty bold thing that Sydney did. But really, they had no choice. But for the young sailors in that ship, there were reports in the engine room, for example, of paint flakes being shaken loose in the engine room. And these young seamen calmly going about their duties with brooms. And in the midst of this action, they can't see what's going on. All they can hear is this commotion. And the chief engine room artificer observes a couple of his young seamen stokers quietly sweeping up the paint chips. And at that point, he observed that he had nothing to worry about his ship's company. So you really start to see how well this crew is working together. They've been in action, they've been subject to air attack, there's the constant threat of mines, the constant threat of submarines, and by this point, they really are a mature and dependable fighting machine.
Peter, this is the first really significant action in the Mediterranean where the Italians have been quite badly defeated. What was the outcome of this action?
Yeah, it was the first major warship loss when the Colleone was sunk. And in the diary of the Italian foreign minister, who was the brother-in-law of Mussolini, he makes the point that the Mussolini was depressed that day after news of the engagement, not so much because of the loss, but he felt that the Italian Navy had not fought well that day. So it had a psychological impact on the Italians, certainly, and it also had in some ways, an even bigger psychological impact in the Allied fleet. The Mediterranean fleet were buoyed by that news of the sinking, not only because of just the loss, but the fact that really a smaller force had been able to engage these 2 cruisers and drive them off. And I think also it shows that whole mentality piece. Following on from John's point, Sydney went into that action having fired about 2,000 rounds of 6-inch in previous engagements. The 2 Italian ships had not fought an enemy action before. So for them, this was their first time. And you saw that inexperience also in terms of the lookout in the Italian flagship. They misidentified the Havoc as being another cruiser. So Casati thought he was up against 2 cruisers when they appeared in that sort of gloom, but it was actually only just Sydney and a destroyer. So that coloured Casati's sort of view, but it really was, they weren't as battle-hardened and offensively minded as Sydney. And so the immediate impact in the Italians was after almost like a draw, if you like, in terms of Calabria, then to have this loss that played heavily, and then equally on the Mediterranean fleet, they were really buoyed by the outcome.
I think the other thing to remember also is on the Italian side, many of her sailors were conscripts.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a big delta there between, you know, well-trained sailors and, in Sydney's case, well-trained veterans now, if you like, against people who've been pressed into service with little training. Yes, they had good ships, they were modern, they were fast, but when it comes down to the crew and the capability, when they're conscripts, as many of the Italians were, not all of them, but a large percentage, that's also a factor to take into consideration.
So leading on from that, John, what was the feeling back in Australia when news of this victory came through?
Well, I mean, for the second time in Australia's history, a ship named Sydney had dispatched an enemy cruiser. And I think that it's important to bring this up now, particularly for the next episode also, that Australia back then was a much smaller place with a smaller population, and most towns and cities throughout Australia knew someone or had someone serving in HMAS Sydney or elsewhere in the Navy. So the adventures of these ships overseas are followed with great interest. So when this news comes back to Australia that Collins and the Sydney have in fact been in this action with not one but two Italian cruisers, it's received jubilantly, and it's very much seen as beginning to add to this myth-like shroud that surrounds Sydney's story henceforth. As Wes brought up, the lucky ship, right? The ship that during her time in the Mediterranean was subject to something like 88 actions and came through unscathed, with the exception of the hit on the funnel and a minor injury to one of her men. So great jubilation and great plans put in place for the time when she came home.
It was also important for Britain. The war was going very badly. France had fallen, and Britain itself was under attack. The Luftwaffe were in the middle of their air assault on Britain. So this was the victory that everyone was praying for, and it was delivered in spades. It was just a bolt out of the blue, and even Sydney's crew, they were pretty excited about it. They were disappointed. If it had been a Royal Navy ship they were on, they would have been issued with a ration of rum, spliced the main brace. But they didn't have that luxury, so Collins still thought of his boys and announced after the action that they would get an extra ration of half an ounce of butter for their dinner.
It worked strategically also because that action prevented and did not see the Italians venture into that part of the Mediterranean afterwards for a very, very long time. So in effect, it was an effective example of sea denial, if you like.
Peter, I'll just ask a question there that when Collins came back to Alexandria and he had to go and see Admiral Cunningham and explain the action, I think he was chastised slightly for being out of position.
Yeah, so when they had a tumultuous welcome in Alexandria Harbour, where all the ships lined and cheered the ship, and Egyptians and soldiers from the quayside also joined in, Cunningham came on board, and then essentially said he was like surprised to see you were there. Where did you get your orders from? And Collins said, well, from Providence, and Cunningham then said, well, you can continue to take your orders from Providence. Yeah. But I think that showed that Cunningham's approach of giving commanding officers scope and latitude and to imbue that offensive spirit really paid off.
Whereas the Italians were out of the fight for a little while, but they came back again, and Sydney went off on some actions in Scarpanto, I think in September. Can you lead us into that activity?
Yeah, the Italian Navy was now rarely to be seen, but the Italian Air Force was still a problem. They had a number of airfields in the Dodecanese, and these were the aircraft responsible for the almost nightly air raids on Alexandria, on his fleet when it was at sea, and Cunningham had had enough. He'd just had his fleet reinforced by the aircraft carrier Illustrious, so he decided to take advantage of his extra air capability by launching attacks on these airfields in the Dodecanese. Sydney and destroyer Ilex, they were tasked with going in towards Scarpanto and destroying an airfield there at Macri-Yalo. I hope the pronunciation's right. It was to be a dawn attack. The only problem is the airfield was on a peninsula that jutted out from the island. At the base of that peninsula was a defended harbour. So Collins was a little bit concerned about trying to conduct his bombardment while steaming in and then drawing the crabs from the harbour defences. So he decided to go the other way. He decided on a surprise attack. He would go in towards the harbour first and then do the bombardment on the way out. And to preserve the element of surprise, he disguised Sydney to make it look more like a Condottieri class cruiser. Amongst the modifications, he had a timber and canvas frame put on the forward funnel so it looked like the uptake of the Italian cruiser, the boiler uptake. And this worked brilliantly. His plan, the disguise, worked brilliantly. He got in and was just about to commence his gun run when some Italian motor torpedo boats came out to investigate this, what they thought was a friendly warship arriving unannounced. Collins had great faith in the destroyer captain, and he allowed Ilex to do the deed on these motor torpedo boats. Meanwhile, he did his bombardment, got off all his rounds, got away scot-free, as did Ilex. The only problem came when he had to rejoin the fleet. He'd forgotten to take down his disguise. And he was initially mistaken for an Italian cruiser, and it was a near-run thing. He was almost shot up by his own people. When Cunningham heard of this, he must have had a laugh because he signalled Sydney, "Well done, you are a stormy petrel." So yeah, by this stage I think Cunningham loved Sydney and he loved Collins. He knew he had a good skipper and a good warship that could do virtually anything he asked of her.
So Peter, Cunningham sends Sydney in harm's way yet again up into the Adriatic.
Yeah, so to set the scene here, there are two things going on in the war. One was that the Italians were engaged in the invasion of Greece. They were using Albania as a staging point for those operations. The roads in Albania weren't good, so a lot of the supplies for the operation were going from sea, from the east coast of Italy, particularly the port of Brindisi, across to Albania. And so Cunningham decided to do two things. The main part of his plan was, in fact, to use Illustrious. Now he had this modern carrier that was talked about, to do a strike on the main Italian fleet base at Taranto. So this was the first time that a carrier had been used to engage a battle fleet in harbour. So that was going to happen, and at the same time that night, Pridham Whipple, who'd replaced Tovey in charge of the 7th Cruiser Squadron, he took Orion, Ajax, Sydney, 2 destroyers, Nubian and Mohawk, up into the Otranto Strait, looking for, as Colin said on the broadcast that night, looking for trouble to tell his sailors what was going to happen, but essentially looking for one of these convoys going across. So they didn't precisely know whether there'd be a convoy there, and equally, the convoy that they saw, which was 4 merchant ships coming back from Albania empty, with an armed merchant cruiser, the Ram 3, as the lead escort, and an old World War I torpedo boat destroyer, the Nicola Frambrisi, as the escort. They were unexpecting an attack because they were so far north, north of the main Italian naval base. So it was going to be a bit of a surprise when they in fact came into contact with one another. So the two forces in the middle of the night came into contact, and the cruisers set upon the convoy. The Frambrisi, which was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Bambini, really was very aggressive in its defence of the convoy, started engaging the cruisers, firing torpedoes. In complete contrast, the Ram 3 continued west and was firing a couple of rounds from its stern guns to get away. But the torpedo boat really tried to defend the merchantman, but all 4 ships were sunk. In fact, Sydney engaged all 4. It was a real melee as the cruisers fired guns and torpedoes and sank these ships. The torpedo boat destroyer was then left by itself to recover the merchantman crew. The cruisers then cleared south, I should say. Sydney had a torpedo fired against it and missed. So once again, that luck held out. And indeed, the commanding officer of the torpedo boat destroyer won the gold medal of valour, like the equivalent of the Italian VC, for his efforts in defending the convoy. But Sydney did extremely well in terms of that action, sinking or having a major part in sinking those 4 merchant ships.
It does show that Sydney was up against a dedicated foe at times.
Yeah, that's right, and certainly that's the point. And post the deployment, Collins makes that point time and again about the valour of his opponents.
So John, Sydney leaves the Mediterranean in January 1941 after nearly 8 months away, heads home to Australia. How would you sum up her time in that theatre?
Well, I think as you've heard today that she accounted for herself exceptionally well. She went over there with a well-trained but not a battle-hardened crew. They adapted very, very well to the situation that they were faced with. They integrated exceptionally well with the Royal Navy and gave a wonderful account of themselves in some pretty major actions. I think it is worth commending the Italians. They weren't a foe to be taken lightly. And it was one of those campaigns, the Mediterranean campaigns, that you started to see this jointery coming into effect as well, where particularly when it comes to the air cover, I think that the British were fortunate to have organic air cover from their carriers, and that was vital to this campaign. But it wasn't just an ad hoc thing. The whole campaign in the Mediterranean was very, very carefully managed from a strategic output, from a joint perspective. So it's one of those really good cases where we actually start to see the Navy, Army and Air Force and organic air forces come together and work well together to achieve the aim, which was to gain sea control of the Mediterranean. Now, that didn't happen, when Sydney left. This struggle in the Mediterranean goes on and on. But I think that as far as Sydney's contribution is concerned, when those men came home and were greeted and marched down George Street, they could, quite happily hold their heads high.
Peter, have you got anything else to add to
I'd just say that if you look at Australia's naval history, this was probably the most successful deployment by a ship in a theatre of war.
Wes, any last thoughts on Sydney and the Mediterranean, noting you've written 2 books extensively on her history?
Sydney was lucky. She escaped from that theatre with no casualties. She had 1 man who died of illness, 3 broke down with their nerves, but no deaths in battle. The ship came out relatively unscathed, no serious damage to speak of. A lot of people put that down to Collins's ship handling. Others put it down to the quality of the ship itself that had been built and the men themselves and how they operated it. But a lot of the lower ranks also put their faith in their cat, the black cat Mitty. She'd joined the ship very early on, was like an early warning system for air raids, and they were determined that this black cat was going to come home with them. It had got them all the way through the Med, and they were determined to bring that cat home, and they did.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming along today. Sadly, that's all we have time for. My thanks to John, Peter and Wes for sparing the time to talk about HMAS Sydney and her illustrious career in the Mediterranean. And thank you for joining us.